In this video, we'll have a look at creating a 3D model from a black and white image. This is meant to be a beginner-friendly workflow, and we'll go over it step by step, so that you can definitely repeat it yourself. After that, we'll briefly look at using the result in a sculpting workflow to create an interesting 3D concept. I wanted to revisit this topic in a little bit more detail, because I keep getting questions about it, and some things have changed also in Blender with how trace image to grease pencil works. It's actually improved. And what this topic was about, if you didn't watch this video, it's about making little thumbnails, black and white thumbnails, in this case of robots, and just dropping them into Blender and then turning that into a mesh through the convert to grease pencil tool. But let me show you how that has changed. And at the end of the video, I also want to show you a slightly different workflow that I think is maybe a bit more evergreen and that is perhaps also easier and even more creative. I just want to give you both workflows so you can choose for yourself. So let's go into Blender, and I have here Blender 4.3.2. So the way this works is, first of all, I would go to the front orthographic view and then drop in this concept art and press Alt G to center it. So this is just a little black and white sketch that I made in Krita just now. And as you can see, everything is separated into these distinct islands. Let me just turn off the grid so you can see better. So there's white lines between everything, and that just makes it easier for Blender to separate it into mesh islands as well. And so let me just turn that back on. So let me just select this and then go to Object, Convert, and then Trace Image to Grease Pencil. And just use the default options. And so now we can turn this empty, which was the concept art that I dragged in. We can turn it off. And then we have this grease pencil object. And as you can see, it's created in edit mode all these vertices. And now let me just go again to convert and then choose mesh. And this is already where it's a little bit different than the old versions of Blender, because before you had to first go to path and then you could convert that path to mesh. And now you can go straight from grease pencil to mesh, which is great. And it's still called grease pencil in the outliner, but this is now just our normal mesh. And if I go to edit mode, you can see it has a ton of vertices, way too many vertices in fact. But it has separated everything into individual islands. So I can just hover over this and press L to select these individual islands, as you can see. And I could already select everything and press F, and that would fill all of these and turn these into mesh planes. And I could just extrude them and everything. And this is already quite different from the old version of Blender. So just to show you how different it is, this is Blender 4.0.2, so a few versions ago. And if I go to Object, Convert, Trace Image to Grease Pencil, and then click on OK, and turn off the empty, and then Object, Convert. Then I have to go to Path first. And then it's already a bit confusing in the outliner, like which one is the mesh. So if I turn off the grease pencil one, okay, then the trace is the mesh. And then I can look at this in edit mode, and it looks like it's a mesh, but it's not. So I have to convert it now to a mesh. And now it has just changed the icon here. It's still called trace, but now this is a mesh, and it has significantly more vertices if you look at this compared to the 4.3.2 one. So this one seems to be a bit more efficient. So in Blender 4.3.2, you can see there are less vertices than in Blender 4.0.2. And if I now select everything with A and then press F to fill them, at first nothing is happening. And then it's only filled this. So with the exact same drawing, it actually doesn't work in Blender 4.0.2. And it worked right off the bat in Blender 4.3.2. So they have definitely improved something behind the scenes here. And so if you're going to use this kind of workflow, I recommend that you use the latest version of Blender. So now to clean this up, because we want this to be kind of mechanical and machined looking. And now this is a bit too organic because there are just too many vertices. And what we can do is we can just press A to select all and then go to Mesh, Clean Up, and then Limited Dissolve. And as you can see, that already took a lot of the vertices away. So it's set to 5 degrees, and that's a good default value. And then one more thing you can do is you can press M and then merge by distance. And then you can try increasing this value and seeing what you get. However, I would advise to first press P and separate by loose parts. And so now we can still select everything in object mode and then tab to go to edit mode. So we still have everything selected in edit mode, but it is now being considered different object. So when we do the merge by distance, it's never going to merge things from different mesh islands. Now we can try to increase the mesh distance, and we will get a more simple topology like this. I think this is already probably good enough. So 0.0201 meters. Here and there are some loose vertices like this, or like here there are a whole bunch of loose vertices. And what you can do is just again press A and then go to Mesh, clean up and delete loose. That's already deleted all of those. And so this is starting to look more and more clean. And then another thing I would do is just press K for the knife tool and then just go all the way down here. And if you press A, it constrains it to an angle. And then press here, press enter. So now we have split this in the middle. And then in face selection mode, we just select all of these, delete them. And then we can add a mirror modifier to this, like that. And press Ctrl I to invert, Shift to select this one. So we have everything selected. And then as the last thing, we have the one with the mirror modifier, and then we press Ctrl L and copy modifier. So now they all have a mirror modifier, and that just makes it easier for us. We just have to do half the work. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to improve this geometry. So let me just select everything in object mode. So object mode, A to select everything, and then tab to go to edit mode. That way you can work on all the objects in edit mode. You don't have to keep going in and out of edit mode. And one thing I want to do is I want to select all of these vertices in the middle and then just scale them on the x-axis to 0. So S, X, 0, and then enter. And what that is they are all scaled to 0 on the x-axis. But it looks like they are not really in the middle. So what we have is we have the 3D cursor in the center of the world. And if you don't have it there, press Shift S and choose cursor to world origin. And then we set here the transform pivot point to 3D cursor. And now again, if we press S, X, and 0 and enter, then you can see that it really snapped to that 0 position. And then don't forget to turn this back to median point. So now we have these vertices really in the middle. And it looks like here we still have one vertex that we don't need. So maybe just press Ctrl X. So Ctrl X dissolves vertices. And let's see if there are any others that we need to get rid of. Just good to have clean topology that will avoid issues in the future. Let me see, it looks like there are 2 vertices here as well, so Ctrl X. You can always just do a wiggle test where you select the vertex and wiggle it around a bit to see if there's any doubles there. So another thing you can do is select all, press M, merge by distance, and then make sure this is set back to 0.0001 meters. That's the default, otherwise it will start to merge too many things. And if it's not set to that, what you can do is right click and click on reset to default value. Otherwise it's going to start merging things that you don't want to merge. But now there are definitely no double vertices anymore. And now before we add thickness to this, I just want to make sure this is all quads, because now these are all just giant n-gons, and that's not going to subdivide it very well at all. Actually, just let me show you what's going to happen if we use this now. So if we add a solidify modifier to this, and increase the thickness, and then we add a subdiv modifier to this with 2 levels, for example, then you get this kind of blob. And we don't want to have a blob for our mech. We want to have something that looks like a hard surface model. And for that, we need to have quads topology. Hey, before we continue to the tutorial, just a quick plug for the sale that I'm running. So I have a 30% discount of everything. So everything is my book, the hard surface sculpting course in Blender, drag and drop materials, and my new hard surface modeling course. And you can get a 30% discount with the coupon code BDAY because it was because of my birthday. It's extended until Saturday. However, if you're too late for that and you still want to get a big discount, there's a very big discount if you buy my bundle. And the bundle, the hard surface bundle, is with my book, hard surface course, modeling course, and the materials course and assets. And you get $60 off if you buy that. So you can buy that at any time. Now, if you want to turn this into quads, what you can do is you can use the knife tool. So press K for the knife tool, and then left click, and then right click so you can move the cursor, and then left click again to cut, and right click to release it, and then left click again to cut, and then press enter. And as you can see now, I have a bunch of quads. So let me repeat to you how this works. So K for the knife tool, or if you don't want to remember the K keyboard shortcut, just here in the tool panel. The tool panel, by the way, you can open it with T. Here you have the knife tool, and as you can see, it turns the cursor into a little knife. And then you just click on a vertex, and you left click on another vertex. And then to make sure you can continue somewhere, you just right click, and that frees it up. And then you left click again to continue, right click, left click, left click, right click, left click, and so on. And then when you're finished, you just press enter. And so that's also turned into quads. This is already a quad. And yeah, you just continue like that. And it may seem like a lot of work, but it just really takes a couple of minutes, and that's all. So I'm just quickly going to do this so that you don't have to sit through the whole process of me doing this. And if you have something like here, this triangle, what you can always do is just cut to that triangle from there. And then just go back to select tool and then select this one and double G and slide it. And now this is also a quad. And back to vertex selection mode. And then here we have a vertex which is not really contributing anything. So we can just select it and Control X and dissolve it. And I'll just continue cutting with the knife tool. I will say one thing that's very important to pay attention to is that you don't get too much geometry. So you don't want to get too much detail at this stage. You just want to have really as simple quad topology as possible. Sometimes you can even simplify the geometry, like here, this edge, we can just Alt and left click on it and then just Control X, dissolve it. And like this one, we cannot dissolve because it's important for this corner here. Maybe this one, not really doing anything, so Control X, get rid of it. Arguably this we can get rid of as well. Let's see, maybe this one. Well, this one is kind of important. This one is not, so we can get rid of it. And you really want to have as little geometry as possible in the beginning. If you can get rid of some vertices, then just dissolve them. I think this is a good result. And sometimes you have to check, it might look like you have all quads, but if you select one where you're certain that it's quads, and then you press Shift G, and then you choose polygon sides, and it's set to compare equal, then you can see that there are some faces that are not selected, and these are apparently not quads. So for example, this one is not a quad. Let me just go into vertex selection mode, and it's because there's this vertex here. And let's see, I'll have to go back and try that one more time. So G, polygon sides. So this one is also not a quad, and that's because of this vertex here. So let's try that again. Shift G, polygon sides. And so there's this one as well. And we can still cut with the knife tool here. And so let me try that one more time. Shift G, polygon sides. And there's also this one. And that's because apparently there's this little vertex here. So it was quite well hidden if you look at it like this. So I can dissolve that. And so I think now we have everything. So they are all quads now. So sometimes it's important to do a quick check like that with the Shift G select similar menu. You can also find it by going to select here and select similar, and then just choose polygon sides. Because it's just not possible to visually inspect it, because sometimes those vertices are so close together, or something can just be an n-gon and you just think it's a quad because it just looks like a quad. And so now we have this, which is all quads, and let me just quickly save that. And so now we can start adding some thickness to this. So go to search and solidify, and then just increase the thickness. And instead of it going forward like this, we can set the offset to 0. Then it just makes the thickness from out of the center of the object. Let me just quickly turn a matte cap on so that it looks more interesting. And I'll also turn on cavity and shadow and set this to both. That just looks better. Maybe let's use a different matte cap. And I'll press Ctrl I to invert the selection again. Hold Shift and select this object. Then again, press Ctrl L and copy modifiers. So now they all have these mirror and solidify modifiers. And so as you can see now, it's starting to get a bit more three-dimensional. If you want, you can also set this color to random. Then everything has different colors. Maybe that's easier for you to see what you're doing, but I'm just going to leave it like this. And you can now just start increasing the thickness of individual objects. So you can start playing around with that. And so yeah, you can start to increase and decrease the thickness of things as you see fit. And this is already where it starts to get a bit more creative. So now we have this fairly simple block out, and I'm going to add a couple of modifiers to it to make it a bit more interesting. But first of all, we have to apply the Solidify modifier. And now you might be wondering, how do I just apply the Solidify modifier for all of these objects at once? Because if I press Ctrl A and choose Visual Geometry to Mesh, it will just apply the mirror as well. And we want to keep the mirror modifier. So to apply the Solidify modifier for everything, and only the Solidify modifier, we select everything, and then we hold Alt. And with Alt, we click on this and choose Apply. And now all of the Solidify modifiers are applied, but we have kept the mirror modifier for all of the objects. I will say this doesn't work on everybody's configuration, because let me just show you in preferences. Here in Input, I have disabled Emulate 3-button mouse. That's just the default, but that's how I like to work. But some people coming from, for example, 3ds Max, they like to enable that because it's a bit more similar to how they're used to work. And if you have this enabled, then you cannot hold Alt and apply all of these modifiers at once. So if you can't use that trick of holding Alt to apply all the modifiers, then just select this and press Ctrl A and choose Visual Geometry to Mesh. And then you just have to add the mirror modifier again. That's all. So now we have applied the Solidify modifier, and what we can do is just select some object and add 2 subdivision surface modifiers. And we will set this first one to simple, that's very important, and the second one to cat-mul-clark. So to show you what's happening, I'm just going to turn off optimal display and turn on the wireframe. That way you can see exactly what these modifiers are doing. And let me set them both to 0. So this is the mesh the way we have it now. Let me just get an annotation here. So what the simple algorithm does is it doesn't do anything with the shape. It just looks at everywhere where there are two edges and it adds another edge in between. So it's just going to add loops like this. And it's going to do that for everywhere where there are two loops. And let me just show you, if I set this to 1, that's exactly what it has done. And I can just erase these real quick. But what the cat-mul-clark algorithm does is it also adds those loops, but it also smooths everything. And it will smooth it even more if I add more levels. And by combining these, I will kind of protect the shape and also add some smoothness. So I'm kind of reducing how much it smooths the shape. So let me show you if I both set these to 1. And let me just turn off the wireframe now. And you can kind of control with this first modifier how smooth you want the shape to be. So with 0 levels, then it's as smooth as it would normally be with this second one. Let me just increase the levels here. But if I add another level, it will become more blocky. And if I add another level here, it will become even more blocky. So you can kind of control the shapes with this first modifier. And of course, we can set this to shade smooth. And yeah, that's how we can control the shapes for all of these objects. And so what I want to do now is just Control I to invert, hold Shift and select this one. And then Control L to copy the modifiers. And then I'm going to right click and shade smooth. So if you get something like this with this ugly crease in the middle, that's just because there are actually faces here. And you can easily solve that if we just go to front orthographic view, select everything, enable X-ray view and edit mode. And then we can just select these faces. So make sure you have face selection mode enabled and hold Shift and just select all of these. And be careful that you don't select too much. That's everything. And then press X and choose faces. And so now those inner faces are deleted and we have no creases anymore. And so now I can start to decide for all of these objects, like how sharp do I want them to be. For example, this, I can add some more sharpness. Maybe 1 level is enough. I wouldn't add too many levels to this. So don't go too far like this, because that will just add a lot of edges that you don't want. Maybe something like that. And we can still change the thickness of everything later if we want. And because this is all very simple, we can very easily change the shape. So let me just go to face selection mode and select this face and hold Control and select this one. And that selects everything in between as well. And let's say I want to scale this on the Y-axis. So I press S and Y and then move this. If you want, you can also enable a gizmo by clicking on this drop down. And then you can click on scale, for example. And then you can just drag on this green handle. And so that's adjusted that shape slightly. So that has made this a bit more round. And there's also a gizmo for moving. So if I select, for example, these edges here, and then we can move these, or we can select these two and move them forward. So that's a very easy way to change the shape. And so because the geometry is so simple, just these small changes make a big difference. So if I want, I can also rotate this object. However, all of the objects have their origin here in the middle now. And if we want to be able to rotate this easily, then the origin should be in the middle of this object. So if I select all by pressing A, and I go to Object, Set Origin to Geometry, then we have this problem that now the mirroring doesn't work anymore. And to solve that, I can press Shift A and add an empty, and any kind of shape will do. Let me just do that over here so you can see it better. So for example, a sphere. And this is a sphere empty. And if I go to the empty menu here, I can kind of decrease the size. Don't decrease it by pressing S for scale, just do that here. And so now when I select any of these objects and go to the mirror modifier, then I can use this picker icon to select this empty. And so now it's mirroring along that empty again. And now if I press Ctrl I to invert the selection, hold Shift and select this shoulder piece. And then I can do that trick again of holding Alt. And then just click here and choose that empty again. And now I've added it to all of these objects. So all of their mirror modifier have this empty object now as the mirror object. And yeah, this kind of controls where it mirrors from. So it's best to just leave that in the right location. If you accidentally move it and you don't know how to put it back here in the center, just select it and press Alt G. And so now I have the origin here in the middle. And let me just turn on the rotate gizmo as well. And so now I can use these circles to rotate this. And as you can see, I also still have the scale gizmo and the move gizmo. So I can use that to adjust this. Now let's say I want to scale this up. I want to scale it in this direction. Then the problem is that you can see the gizmo is not pointing in that direction. It's just pointing in the coordinates of the world. So what we want to do is go over here to transform orientations and then set this to local. And so then you can see it's pointing in the right direction. So we just use this, we drag on it, and then we can just move it where we want and scale it perhaps some more like this. And then it's best to turn this back to global. And then I can just quickly erase this annotation. And maybe we can move this a bit closer here. So it becomes kind of an antenna or something. And if you just want to be able to freely rotate something, you can just press R twice. Then you can just kind of rotate it like this. And by the way, you can also find those rotation values. If you press N here, then you will get the option panel. And then as you can see here, there's also these rotation values. And I would recommend holding Shift. Otherwise it will go very fast. So with holding Shift, you kind of have a more subtle control over those values. And also the scale and location values are here. I'm just quickly going to go through all of these objects and in edit mode, adjust the shape to make it more interesting. So another thing, if you think it's annoying that you have such a big difference between this cage, which is just the object, the way it looks without modifiers, and the blobby shape of the subdivided mesh, you can always enable here this button. This is the on cage button. And I'll just show you on this one as well. And so now you can see exactly what the modifiers are doing, even in edit mode. So that can be more convenient. And again, if you want to enable that for everything, just go to object mode, select everything, and then just Alt and click on this. You might have to click on it twice. And then you can see in edit mode that they all now have this. That can make it a bit more easy to see what you're doing. And yeah, I'm just sort of pulling on edges and just trying to make these shapes a bit more complicated. And of course, all of these shapes are kind of separated from each other because that's the way it worked with the thumbnail. But you can also just move them and overlap them now, which in some cases just makes more sense. And just kind of place them the way that you want. So for example, this one, we want this to intersect with that other object. If I want this arm shape to be a bit more tapered, so for example, I want it to have kind of like this kind of tapered shape. One thing I can do is I can select this bottom face here. And we can just make sure we are looking at it from the side and then enable proportional editing here. And for example, set it to linear and then just scale it with S and make sure that the fall off is around the whole object. So increase the radius of the fall off with the middle mouse button. And then just, move left or right to scale. So in this case, move to the left and it looks something like this. And we can adjust the shape here by selecting this face and then maybe scaling it up from there. And I will just decrease the radius slightly. And so that's another way to control the shapes as well. And you can also set proportional editing to smooth. And it can be very helpful to quickly adjust some shapes. So just adjust the fall off by scrolling the mouse wheel up and down. That way you can really control how you're affecting the shape. And if I select one of these faces, which are in the middle, so if I move it, then I'm breaking the mirroring. What you can do is you can lock a specific axis. So in this case, I don't want to move it on the x-axis. What I can do is I can press Shift and X. And now I can only move it on the y and the z-axis. So Shift and then the axis that you don't want to affect. In this case, the x-axis. And also here with the feet, I also want to taper it slightly, so like this. And then I'll increase the thickness. And for example, here I want to have a little bit more control over this shape, but there's not enough geometry, so I can always just press Ctrl R, add a loop. If you don't want to remember the keyboard shortcut Ctrl R, let me just do that one. You can use the loop cut tool here. So just left click and then enter to confirm, and then go back to the select box tool. And so yeah, now I have a bit more control over the shapes. And of course now it's from the side not very interesting because it's a very stiff pose. And it's interesting if we can pose it. And to do that, what we can do is we can set here the transform pivot point to 3D cursor. So it's set to 3D cursor. And then just select the things that we want to pose. And then Shift and right click to place the 3D cursor. So now I've placed the 3D cursor there. And now with all these objects selected, I can just rotate it along that position of that 3D cursor. And I can do that again here. So I place the 3D cursor here with shift and right click. So now it's there. And so now I can move this like this. And I can just repeat that. So shift and right click and put the 3D cursor there. And then I can rotate this and maybe just adjust this one more time. So that's already a slightly more interesting pose. And when doing stuff like that, it's best to always set the transform pivot point back to median point, which is the default. Otherwise, you might get confused later about why things aren't rotating the way you expect. And also, I would recommend to reset the position of the 3D cursor with Shift S and cursor to world origin. That way, when you create a new object, it will be in the center of the world. So one more thing that we can do with this setup with these two modifiers is we can start extruding some stuff. And so again, you need to be in edit mode. And it's best to be with face selection mode. And then what we can do is, for example, we can select one or two edges and then just press E to extrude. And then you can extrude it like this. Or if you don't want to remember the E keyboard shortcut, although it's a very common one, you can click here on extrude and then just use this gizmo. But for that, you have to have the gizmo enabled. And then, of course, we can scale down the extrusion and do all kinds of stuff with it. Personally, I like to just use the keyboard shortcut E. It's not all that difficult to remember. So just E and extrude. And I think I will scale this shape up slightly. And I'm just going to turn off proportional editing because I don't want to use it for this. So selecting these edges and just moving them slightly just to adjust the shape. And again, because the geometry is still so simple and it's all quad based, it's very easy to adjust the shape and it stays nice and smooth. Or maybe something like this. Now, let's say I'm not happy with this extrusion. I can just select it and press Ctrl+ to increase the selection. And then just X to delete, so delete faces. And then we're going to Alt and left click in edge selection mode on this and press Ctrl F and G to fill it. So let me show you how you can do that if you don't want to remember all those keyboard shortcuts. So just select these two faces, go to select and then more, and then go to mesh, delete faces, and then in edge selection mode, Alt and left click on this loop, and then go to face and grid fill. And instead of an extrusion, what you can also do is select some faces and press I to inset, and then just press E to extrude inwards. So you can also create this kind of hole if you want. And guys, please don't forget to save sometimes, because I get messages sometimes on YouTube where people say that they lost 3 hours of work because something crashed. But things will crash sometimes. And if you don't save for 3 hours, that's really irresponsible. So definitely save every half hour or something and set an autosave up for every 10 minutes. And here I just want to create some extrusion and I'm going to press Ctrl I to inset. I don't want it to inset like this. And so what I'm going to do is press B, and that will respect the boundary of the mirror modifier. So again, B to turn on boundary. And if you forget that keyboard shortcut, just look at the bottom row of the screen and you will see some helpful tips there. And I'm going to press G and Y to move this like that. And I'm just going to adjust this shape slightly. And to minimize these gaps between all these objects, I'm just going to select them all in object mode and then go to edit mode and just Alt A to deselect anything. And then I'll turn on X-ray mode so I can see and select through all of these objects. And then I'm just going to move them with proportional editing enabled. But to make sure that they are not all affected by the proportional editing, I'm just going to go into this menu and choose connected only and select that. And that way I can just move the vertices on the individual objects. And I'm just sort of overlapping them all. And sometimes you do have to make sure that you only have one object selected so that you can just move only one vertex. Otherwise, sometimes you will select everything. And so instead of just clicking on a vertex, I'm just dragging a box. And that way I'm selecting all the way to the other side of the object as well. So I'm selecting the vertices on the other side as well. And here I'm just pressing G and Z to move this down on the Z axis only. And G and Z to move it up. And then I'll just move these. And in some cases, like for example here, there's just a big gap between these arms. And that's just because I didn't draw anything in there in the design. And one thing you can do to solve that real quick is just select one of these objects and then just Shift D to duplicate them. And then you can just kind of try to rearrange them, maybe make them fit like this, for example. And let's see from the side, and just press R twice if you want to have free rotation. And then of course we can still adjust this object. So with proportional editing enabled, we can still fine tune the shape. So we can make it fit better in this location. And let's see, we can also just select these two faces and press Ctrl and plus, and then just delete them. So X and faces. And then in edge selection mode, just Alt and left click on this and press Ctrl F and then choose grid fill, or alternatively go to face and grid fill, just so that that is filled again. And in this case, I want this shape to be a bit rounder. And what I'm going to do is just add a loop here. So Ctrl and R. And with this loop still selected, the way we can scale that up is either by pressing S, and then you will get something like this. Or if I undo that real quick, you can do Alt S, and Alt S generally is better in this kind of case because it scales along the normals direction. And then I'm going to go to vertex selection mode and then press Ctrl and I to invert the selection. So now I have these selected. And then I'm going to right click and choose smooth vertices. And I'll press Shift R, which just repeats the last action. And then you get this kind of thing. So now I've made this shape a bit rounder. And in fact, if I press A to select everything and then right click and choose smooth vertices, then it becomes even smoother. And then I can press Alt S and inflate it again like this. And it gives us this kind of shape. And I would like to have some kind of spherical socket here. So what we can do is Shift and right click to place the 3D cursor there. And then we can go to Add, Mesh, and Cube. And let's create an enormous cube. So let's scale that down. And then with this cube selected, we'll hold Shift and select any other object. And then Ctrl L and copy modifiers so that this has all those modifiers now as well. And just set it to shade smooth. And maybe let's scale this up and move it over here. And now we've created this kind of ball joint, which is the simplest kind of joint for a Mac object. And let's change the shape of this thing. Let's add a loop so that we can use these vertices here to adjust the shape like this. And I will put the cursor back at the world origin. Once you have a nice simple base mesh, you can start to invent more detail. There are a few directions that you can go in, either polygonal modeling or using booleans or sculpting. In this case, I decided to practice my sculpting techniques. I tend to keep things simple when sculpting. I mainly use the grab brush, scrape brush, and the smooth brush. Using the grab brush, you can quickly adjust the shape. And clay strips helps to refine the shape. I have the brushes that I use most in my quick favorites menu. That way I can work in full screen or on a tablet screen. The draw brush is also useful for quickly drawing where you may want to separate an object or to add a rough panel cut. By holding Ctrl, you can invert the brush, so the clay strips brush then removes volume, for example. Often you can get really far with just the grab brush. These objects all have a multi-rest modifier on them, and you can change their shape quite a lot, even though the underlying base remains unchanged. It's fun to use the scrape brush to flatten areas like this. If you get this kind of glitch, that's because for whatever reason the auto masking option is enabled. That can be quite frustrating if you don't know what's causing it. Another useful brush is the inflate brush to quickly add some volume, which you can then refine with the scrape brush. Sometimes it's good to inflate the volume of a mesh so that you have something to remove in order to create more interesting shapes. So inflating things and then using the scrape brush can work really well. If you're not happy with the result, you can always use the smooth brush to smooth it out and then try again. Every now and then I practice modeling some greeble objects. I mark them as assets so that later I can always drag and drop them on the model. You can also use alpha brushes to add detail or to integrate the greeble objects better. It can be challenging to integrate those greebles sometimes, so it can be easier to just retopologize a sculpted part with some normal polygonal modeling. That way you have more precise control over the shape. With the Polyline Face Set tool, you can draw a face set in shapes like this. And then you can use that face set to create a mask and use the mask to separate the area into a new mesh. Here you can see the big difference between the base mesh and what I sculpted, which is stored in the multi-res modifier. By clicking on Apply Base, the base mesh shape is adjusted to more closely resemble what you've sculpted. A technique that I like a lot and that I developed for my hard surface sculpting course is using tiling displacement maps to quickly experiment with adding hard surface details. It's a really fun and creative technique, and it honestly feels a bit like cheating. Once you've set up the modifiers with the displacement for one object, you can just copy the modifier stack to other objects. Here you again see how different the base mesh and the multi-res result can be. I applied the multi-res modifier with a low resolution so that I have a good base mesh for the tiling displacement to do its thing on. Of course, this is all explained in much more detail in my video course, and the files for that are included there as well. Here I'm using a different tiling displacement map, this one with cables. By controlling the displacement with empties, you can quickly experiment. I wasn't happy with the shoulders, so I remeshed them with Blender's built-in quad remesh option to get a simple quad base mesh. I then tried some more tiling displacement on it until I found something that I liked. And suddenly it reminds me of the Metroid games. After adding the tiling displacement, I use some alpha brushes for smaller details. Finally, I add some materials from my drag and drop mech materials course to create a quick render. The good thing about these materials is you don't need UV maps, so you can just drag and drop them on this kind of messy geometry and they'll just work. That's really fun when you've worked on sculpting something and you just want to create some quick renders. So at the beginning, I promised to show you an alternative workflow to the trace image to grease pencil workflow. And for that, I'm just going to use this default cube. This is a cube effect. And it has the symbol and the Catmull-Clark modifier. So it's the double subdiv modifier technique. And yeah, but the first one you can control how square it is. And the second one, it doesn't really need 2 levels, but you can control the smoothness. And basically just what you can do is just Shift D and duplicate it. And let's go to X-ray mode, either by clicking on this or with Alt Z, you can toggle X-ray mode on. Then of course you see the original mesh, but if we click on the on cage button here, it will follow the subdivided mesh. And then, yeah, we can just start adjusting the shape. And this is basically what is called box modeling. And let me just turn this up 1 level and we can maybe adjust it a bit more. So by using X-ray mode, we can select everything all the way to the other side. And sometimes you just have to press Ctrl R and then just add another loop. And I seem to have turned off optimal display. If you enable optimal display, then you just see less geometry, which it can be confusing if you see all those additional subdivided loops. So just enable this. And then, yeah, we can just adjust the shape. And let's add another loop. And the more loops you have, the more you can, of course, adjust the shape. But of course, the more loops you have, also the more difficult it will be to adjust the shape. So it's best to only add the loops that you really need. Now I can adjust these like here. And yeah, by adding another level here, I can make it even more precise. And it's just a matter of just dragging things to match the shape. And that gives us this nice quad topology. And of course, we can add loops to that. And we can start adding detail to it and so on. So yeah, as you can see, it's also very easy and very quick to work this way. You can have very nice quad topology very quickly. And it's up to you to decide which technique is better for you or which is faster. The biggest factor in deciding which of these 2 techniques you will use is the underlying sketch. So let's say I created a really messy, quick sketch with a pencil on a napkin or whatever, and it's just going to be too rough for trace image to grease pencil to turn it into a nice, clean mesh. And in that case, I would recommend using this technique with just this cube with these 2 modifiers and just duplicating it and then adjusting it in X-ray mode. Just box modeling, in other words. And if you're creating a sketch in advance with the express purpose of using trace image to grease pencil, then you know that you can create these white lines between everything and then it will work very easily. And in the end, I think both techniques will take about the same amount of time. So it's really up to you which technique you prefer. Personally, I probably would go for this technique instead, because I like to just draw on paper. I actually prefer to draw on paper than on the computer. So in my case, it's much more likely that I just have some sketches that I did with pencil on paper. And in that case, this technique will be better. This was just a quick overview of a possible hard surface concepting workflow. If you're interested in this kind of thing, you should know that there's a $60 discount on all my hard surface courses and book if you buy them all together in a big bundle. You can find the link to that in the description of this video. Thanks for watching all the way to the end.